to another episode of RPMbassy. Today we're going through an album that I actually thought I'd already covered, and then I looked back through and I realised, oh wait, no, we've never actually spoken about this album on the channel. So, long overdue in my opinion. This is all about System of a Down and Toxicity. So, a lot of people have probably heard of this album, probably heard this album as well. So this is their 2001 second album from the band. It's sort of a new metal kind of album, but in my opinion it's kind of like almost the sort of the beginning of the decline of that sort of subgenre, and not necessarily decline in a bad way, but it sort of it marks the kind of like turning point. Like the year previous, in 2000, you'd had Hybrid Theory by Linkin Park, you'd had White Pony by Deftones, you'd had Chocolate Starfish by Limp Bizkit. You know, you'd had these huge sort of like name-making albums for a bunch of bands that were kind of like the pinnacle and were kind of the sort of the flagship albums of the new metal movement. And then following that, it seemed to slow down and decline a bit. The bands themselves started moving away into different sort of sounds, and I think this is kind of like the sort of start of, along with White Pony, sort of the start of albums in that sort of category moving into perhaps more thoughtful and grown up perspectives, I would say. Obviously System of a Down as a band, you know, they're an Armenian American band. A lot of what they wrote about, even with the album previous, that was very politically charged and was, again, very thought out. Not necessarily always the most grown up, and we'll cover that with some of the lyrics in this in a moment. But there was always a lot of intent behind it, which perhaps some of the other bands in the sort of subgenre didn't necessarily always have. Limp Bizkit especially. But yeah, this album, as I say, I think this is kind of the changing of the wind almost, in terms of that kind of sound, that kind of style. Audibly, they didn't necessarily always have that kind of feel anyway. They were sort of lumped in with that kind of group, but they always kind of felt slightly separate regardless. So I think it makes sense that this is kind of where everything started to change within the metal scene. So yeah, this one was a widely successful album. Hit number one in the US and in Canada, I believe, which is kind of like a landmark achievement for something that most people would consider not the most accessible album. But it's one of those crossover albums that, like, friends of mine who are not into metal, have never really expressed any interest in metal. Like System of a Down is one of those bands where actually they still like respect and listen to them, and they enjoy the album, and it's one of those things like for example, like MF Doom. A lot of people who don't care about hip hop will still listen to MF Doom and that sort of thing. So I think it's kind of an important album in that regard. And as far as the content goes, as I said, like lyrically, there are some very, very weird bits and pieces on here. And one song in particular we'll come on to with that aspect. But the album top to bottom is like pretty fantastic. It's very apparent why it did so well, not only in terms of performance, but also critically. Like, it was like widely commended, and deservedly so. It is an excellent album, and it feels really sort of taught and thought out in terms of the layout of the songs. Like for me, you kind of like have a side A, side B, obviously in this case of an LP, but also just in terms of the presentation and the perspective of the lyricism and the way the songs feel. Side A feeling like very aggressive, very angry, and sort of there's kind of like, it's almost like aggressive and sort of aggro and complainy, whereas side B, there's a lot more introspection, there's a lot more sort of deep lyrical topics, and it's deep lyrically throughout the whole album, but it's more apparent, I feel, on the second half of the album. So we'll just go sort of like through some of the tracks that I really want to point out. As for the actual insert, it does bring all of the lyrics on there, so I can actually go through the one in particular that I very much want to mention. But one thing I'll say about Serge Tankian and the vocalist's lyrical approach, the way he writes, and presumably the way the other band members write, because I believe the lyricism is sort of a shared aspect between Serge the vocalist, Darren the guitarist, and Shalvo the bassist. And a lot of the time you find that there are phrases and sentences that really shouldn't fit rhythmically, and I think there's a lot of effort to make sure that they actually get the message across in the particular way they want to say it. There's a lot of nuance in some of these weird passages, and it doesn't feel forced. Like rhythmically, some of it is very odd, and it's placed weirdly, and there's a lot of like very fast syllables kind of being thrown into a short space of time, but actually it works very well. You've got this kind of frenetic energy about the album anyway, so it kind of all adds up to give the sort of mood a bit of energy. But yeah, one of the lyrics I want to bring up, because I imagine anybody who's kind of heard the album before will know this lyric, but it's from song 2, Needles, and it's pull the tapeworm out of your ass, hey, and it's just repeated. That's basically the chorus, and that's repeated 4 times for each chorus. I love that lyric. It's a great lyric. Obviously big songs from this one, Chop Suey, that's kind of like the big breakout song for them. I think most people have probably heard that, especially if you watch like music TV in the early and mid 2000s. Like that was all over a bunch of different channels, and as I say, it was kind of like a big crossover hit in that people who didn't listen to metal still know that song now. Other sort of big songs for me, you obviously had the song Toxicity and the song Aerials, which were other singles from the album. But for me, the song X, which is track 5, that is almost like if you remember a while ago I spoke about Hexagram by Deftones, it's got that same sort of feel to it in terms of it being one of the most simplistic tracks possible. It's basically only a couple of riffs, but it just has such an energy. It's so heavy, it's so forward, and at 2 minutes long, it's not long enough to kind of get bored of, so you get the joy of being able to listen to it again and again and again, which I love. I always prefer a song to make me want more than to bore me out with like a 10-minute piece. Give me the choice whether or not I want to repeat it. But yeah, lyrically, very, very, very simple. You've got the phrase, we don't need to multiply, we don't need to nullify. That's kind of like repeated all the way through. So very similar to Deftones' Hexagram in terms of like you've got a couple of key phrases and lyrical motifs that are kind of just throughout the song, and that's it. Chop Suey, as I say, big song for them. You got this kind of like soaring chorus along with the very aggressive and those weird timed vocal passages, which it's basically rap for those verse periods, which I really, really enjoy. Some of the more kind of thoughtful pieces, Atwa or ATWA. I always used to think it meant like all the world awaits or all the world awaiting or something like that, but actually apparently it means like air, trees, water, animals, which I didn't realise. But the reason why I thought that it meant what I thought it meant was the second lyric, the second line in it is all the world I've seen before me passing by, and I thought that was kind of where the name came from. That's a fantastic song, very sort of like deep, very well written song in terms of guitar sound and just the overall composition. And you kind of got this sort of stop start kind of feel with the album, where you have that sort of aggressive first half, and then the second half, as I mentioned, it's got like more introspective lyricism. The actual tonality of the songs is still kind of like you've got back and forth between aggression and kind of sonic palette cleansers. You know, it's really well arranged in terms of just a track listing. There's not too much fatigue going on. You're not kind of like getting blasted with stuff for too long before you kind of have a bit of a break, which is really, really well thought out. The title track, Toxicity, that's got some of the most poetic and weird lyricism on the album, and that was a song that it took me a long time to get into when I first heard the album, but actually now it's an all-time favourite, and probably one of the best tracks they ever did as a band. That again has some weird bits and pieces. You've got like looking at life through the eyes of a tire hub, eating seeds as a pastime activity, like just odd things that kind of remind me of like how Aesop Rock, obviously a rapper, not a metal musician, but kind of remind me of his lyricism, where actually everything's kind of spoken in simile and metaphor, and you kind of have to dissect it and perhaps potentially bring on your own meaning to it. And the final track, Aerials, is for me another phenomenal song, and I think that it highlights the sort of skill as a band to create this sort of level of sound. Obviously, it's a studio piece, so you've got the ability to record extra layers and things like that. And I'm not blind to the fact that you're double tracking guitars, if not quad tracking guitars, etc. But the way that they sound as a 4-piece and can kind of like replicate it live, I think Aerials is probably the best example of that. They just have this huge sound, and I think that's probably the best overall performance that they've ever done, for my money at least. Serj Tankian's vocals, he's got such a kind of like theatrical kind of vocal style in a way, and to have that song with the kind of lyricism that it has, sort of the nature themes and very sort of peaceful lyricism. You almost sort of think it's like an Enya song or something, but the way that that's kind of performed with this heavy guitar, with the ambient verse passages, I think it like caps off the album fantastically. You do have a hidden track at the end of the album, which is called Arto, which is a sort of arrangement and interpretation of an old Armenian like sort of folk piece, I believe. But Aerials really is sort of the final track in reality. It has a very spiritual kind of feeling to it, and it does very much cap off the album in a fantastic way. It also serves again as a perfect palate cleanser from the song prior, which is Psycho, which is all about like cocaine and groupies, which you've got that kind of back and forth of themes and tonality and stuff. I think probably most people have heard this album. As far as this pressing that I have goes, it's not an overly impressive one in terms of the presentation. Like, we've literally got the outer sleeve and inner sleeve with a couple of photos, which they are nice photos, but this is the same stuff that would have been on the CD copy as well. I remember having the CD back in like 2002 or something, and this is the sort of same liner section. Record itself is literally just black vinyl, simple as. I'm not 100% sure about what other options exist for a vinyl version of this, but I think this one, especially this album, is one that would be deserving of like a nice big re-release. I know that the album itself, they ended up recording something like 30 odd songs for it, so perhaps something like Linkin Park did with Meteora a couple of years ago, where they kind of have the sort of collected demo set and everything all in one. I think that would be really nice to see. Perhaps it already exists, I'm not 100% sure, but if it doesn't, this album definitely deserves it. Maybe for a 30th anniversary or so, or maybe could try for a 25th anniversary in a couple of years' time. That could perhaps work. But yeah, I think if you haven't heard this album, which I think is probably fairly unlikely considering how popular it was and how big it was at the time and how sort of influential it's gone on to be, I think not only is it just a fantastic album sonically, and like to just like read the lyrics and sort of dissect how it's composed and arranged, but also in terms of the overall impact that I think it's had on the wider metal scene going forward. And I think they sort of peaked here for my money. The albums that came afterwards, they're still very good, but this for me is my favourite. Perhaps people will disagree with that, but this is for me where it was sort of them at their best, doing the best work. So yeah, if you haven't heard it, please do give it a look. It's fairly easy to track down. This one was certainly not a difficult find for me, so I highly recommend it. Give it a look. System of a Down and Toxicity. Cheers.